I've seen some crazy stuff when working search and rescue near the Jefferson Wilderness area in Colorado. I was called in to help after a father and son had got separated while hiking. This son began wandering around for about a week before we found him alive but sickly looking, very thin and extremely aloof. When we finally got him to go lie down in the back of our truck, he would not even make eye contact or even look at us when we talked. He acted like we weren't there and stared off into space and said nothing until his father showed up. But what really made me wonder about the kids were the cuts on his chest and arms. They looked self-inflicted, like with some kind of tool. The story gets more interesting. After getting this kid back safely with the father, search team began finding numerous remnants of camps all over the place. It was like somebody had been living off the land for a while, but they'd done it in numerous places and were constantly moving around. In one spot, we found human remains. It looked like they were from other people's camp's leftovers. No clothing or hair, but bones showed signs of being chewed on by human teeth. After a more extensive search through the area, we came across a person who matched dozens of otherwise eyewitness accounts from hikers and hunters. He was tall, naked, almost half human, covered in dirt and grass, cuts all over his body, and covered with what looked like old blood. Well, we got the kid back to his family safe, but he apparently had some serious mental problems. Meanwhile, we had found this person living alone in a small cavern with some tools and weapons stashed away. We didn't know what to think of him. He was so far gone to communicate with us at all. He was almost feral. When they brought him out of the cavern, he did not even look at us or make any noise. We called search and rescue again for advice on how to proceed with him, even though it wasn't in our jurisdiction. The man clearly needed mental help. They told us that there's not really anything specific for this kind of situation. They asked us to take care of it ourselves until more official people arrived who would have more resources available to them. So we did. The whole team took turns watching him, trying to get him to eat or drink or anything, but he wouldn't respond. I think he was eventually psychologically evaluated, and I don't know what happened to him after that. But I believe that he was cannibalizing on the bodies of campers out there, somewhere. At least that's what I was told by the coroner, from the evidence, that the bones matched his teeth. We don't know his past, his history, or how long he had been out there surviving. But whatever it was or however long it had completely stripped him of almost all of his humanity. He had become nothing more than a feralized cannibal of the wild. My uncle used to work as a forest ranger back in Wyoming, and in family reunions, he'd always tell the most crazy stories. My dad would always claim he exaggerated and made them sound creepier than what they probably were. I thought so too, until a few days ago when they became more real than I ever wanted. Now that I gotta deal with it, I guess if I tell it to somebody, it might be able to help finally bring some light to the events. Anyway, here it goes. My uncle was his every other weekday, just roaming around the forest outskirts, doing some routine patrolling. He was going through his normal route, making sure there was nothing out of the ordinary, but as he walked, he happened to notice something strange on the floor. A few steps away from the path, it seemed like a cocktail sausage from far away. He wasn't sure why it called his attention or how he even managed to spot it here in the middle of the forest floor, but he decided to approach it and give it a closer look. As soon as he got close, he realized the sausage had a nail ring attached to it. It was also definitely not a sausage. It was a freshly severed human finger, lying next to the forest path. Disgusted and disturbed, he decided not to touch and hurry back to his office. Soon, the police were there, and the small forest path became a crime scene. The finger was picked up and forensics performed DNA tests on it. It belonged to a young woman named Katie Roth, who at this point had been reported for around 90 days. Her last known location had been near that very forest. As you'd expect, this discovery reignited the spirits of her search. The finger had clearly been cut not too long ago. She was probably still in the area. The police began a series of collective search and rescue missions around the forest with the help of neighbors. They did their first sweep of the entire area of my uncle's find, but found absolutely nothing. They expanded their search to the entire section of forest, but still, no more traces of Katie were ever found. The police gave it one last try, but sending a few small patrols to check around the entire park for any suspicious activity, they managed to find nothing related to her disappearance. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving only her finger behind. 2 months later, even the police gave up on Katie's case once again, and search parties were dissolved. And just like that, Katie was erased from the town's collective memory once again. Her stray finger an extinguished beacon of hope. My uncle never managed to forget, though. He assures the day he found the finger, he could have just walked a bit deeper inside the forest and ran onto her. He swears he could feel her presence. However, what made him run was the fact that, according to him, she didn't feel entirely human. It had been around 4 months since my uncle's find, and by now, even him had mostly managed to forget about it. Everybody thought that this was the end of it. It was far from over. One of these weeks, as he was doing his daily patrols again, he nearly tripped with a black cardboard box, neatly and inconveniently placed on the main path. He picked it up, carefully opening it. Inside was a neatly handwritten letter and a printed photograph. There were not any letter or photograph. They were a letter written by Katie herself and a photo of her. Frightened but curious, he decided to check them out. The letter was addressed to her parents. It said for them not to worry about her. She found a new home and finally discovered who she was meant to be all along. It was very extenuating and demanding, but after a few months of hard work, she'd finally succeeded. A small physical sacrifice had to be performed for her transformation to be complete. She'd chosen to sever her last worldly attachment, the finger where she wore her engagement ring. The photo showed the missing woman herself, holding her bloody stump towards the camera, smiling. She wore a very fancy cocktail dress, but stood in the middle of the forest. Around her, several figures with bright yellow coats and hoods, wearing grotesque smiley face masks, stood solemnly. Shaken to his core, he took the box straight to the police. And once they confirmed both the photo and the letter were both legitimately hers, the search was reignited. Neighbors weren't called this time, though. They were dealing with something potentially dangerous. By this point, I think it's redundant to say they found absolutely nothing. Just as before, the search went cold again, and Katie was never heard of. My uncle used to constantly have her on his mind. He is one of those people who gets really annoyed about not knowing, so this mystery always gave him a certain amount of unease. I think telling us about it was also sort of a release. Otherwise, there were no strings to pull, no yellow brick road to follow. He just had to live with the mystery, or so we thought. On one of his last weeks, an old friend from work paid him a visit. At first, they just made a bit of small talk, but suddenly, he had brought up Katie's case. My uncle didn't quite feel comfortable talking about it, but then his friend brought some new light. Somebody had found one of those smiley masks from the photo, left exactly on the area he had on his previous findings. I could see relief on his face. He'd begun to think he might have just imagined it all. He talked to me and told that, even though he'd made his peace with it, he'd be happy if he knew I would try and find out the truth. So, I guess I gotta do it for the old man. If anybody has heard anything or something similar to what I just described, let me know. Let's see if we can finally manage to uncover what happened to Katie. Back in 1996, I worked for the Wildlife Fish and Game in California. While I was working out in the Bay Area, my team and I were specifically called to investigate a suspicious animal sighting near Yosemite National Park by some campers camping in a very isolated location. They claimed they saw something not of this world, as they claimed. We arrived at their location and began our investigations almost immediately. That night, we set up a tent where we gathered with the witnesses and asked them what had happened that day on the campsite. They claimed that it all started when one of them noticed a strange smell from his pop-up camper on the morning after. It was unlike anything they had smelled before, but he had not paid much mind to it, thinking it might be coming from somewhere else nearby. But as the day went on, one of us noticed movement outside the campsite near the tree line. We all looked over and saw a large black creature walking through the wilderness. It was as if it was looking for something. They claimed the thing was massive and had to be at least 8 to 9 feet tall, its body covered in dark matted fur. They were terrified, but it got closer, but they could see its face, which was also covered in hair. But its eyes were the most terrifying. They were bright and glowing red. They didn't know what to do. They began packing up their things to leave immediately, but as they were doing so, this creature began getting closer. It began moving faster. They screamed, running off to their cars, and drove off, leaving behind everything. As they drove away, this thing stood there, watching them from the tree line. It was not moving at all, just standing there, motionless, watching them. It was then that they suddenly remembered. They told me that they believe it was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it. They told us that they believe he protects the forest, but they think they're at harm. After we had listened to their story, we thought it was simply a misidentification of a black bear. We humored them, took down their story, and did a thorough search of the area. We didn't really find any evidence. However, we did find 2 things that are considerable. The first one is a very large scat pile that looked very much like a human scat pile, although much, much larger. Tests are still being run on it as we speak. And the other thing we thought was interesting is within 30 feet of that same scat pile, which is about a quarter mile from their tent site, is a very, very large singular footprint. It measured 19.5 inches long by 9 inches wide, a behemoth human-sized footprint. The indent was about 5 inches deep in the ground. Whatever made this had to be very heavy, and it really made me start pondering the truth and the stories of the whole Bigfoot and Sasquatch phenomenon. As a ranger, I've had my fair share of strange experiences, and one particular stands out. A family was camping near one of our backcountry sites, and the young daughter disappeared in the middle of the night. We had found her several hours later, hiding in a small cave about a mile from the campsite. She was weeping and terrified. When asked her what happened, she told us she had seen a monster that chased her and dragged her away. We never found out what she saw, but it was definitely not anything natural. This is just one of many stories that has been documented by rangers. Many of these involve children who have seen cryptids or other paranormal entities. In some cases, children are never found, and their fate remains a mystery. One such case is that of Aiden Park. On July 22, 2007, Aiden Park went missing from Olympic National Park in Washington State. He was only 6 at the time and was never found. Witnesses reported seeing a large black creature with glowing eyes near where Aiden disappeared. Some believe that this creature may have been responsible for his disappearance. Another tragic case is that of Kenneth. Kenneth was 13, disappearing in May of 1966. He was last seen walking down a rural road in Nova Scotia, Canada. Kenneth's body was eventually found in a wooded area near the road, but the cause of death could not be determined. Many believe that Kenneth was killed by a cryptid known as the Beast of Bladenboro, although that is just speculation, because this particular cryptid is usually seen around North Carolina. However, these are just a handful of strange encounters and missing persons that I could share with you. As you know, David Paulides has actually gone on to share many of these stories, but I have many stories he has not yet uncovered, and I would like to share them with you. If your audience would appreciate it, I think they would like to hear more of these. Let me know, and thank you for all that you do. I live in Chesterfield, Missouri, and my family isn't really rich, but we are comfortable. So, pretty much my whole life, I've had some kind of job so that I can buy myself anything I need that my parents don't want to buy me. So mostly the useless stuff. Last summer, I got an amazing job as a park ranger in the Gateway Arch National Park here in St. Louis, Missouri. It was not a far drive from where I lived, and I don't need to worry about transportation. Also, it was by far the coolest and most exciting and interesting job I've ever had. I got to see the nature, and it was very fun and exciting. I love working with people, and the park is pretty popular. It also has a lot of visitors. I had just begun working there, so I didn't exactly know the park by heart, and I still needed to learn about many of the parts and activities in it. So I was starting to be placed mostly on the night shifts. That didn't really quite suit me because I was not a night owl and would be moody during the night. But the upside was there was really not a lot of work, and the older rangers would do most of it, so I would either sit around or walk or try and explore. There was a guy working on my shifts. I really liked him. So one night, when there wasn't a lot of work, I asked him to take a walk with me and Daisy, his guard dog, to check up on if everything was in order. He was also new to the job, so you can see how obvious it was that I was checking up on the park. We were joking around for a while, walking next to the river, and Daisy suddenly slipped away and began chasing something. I ran after her as fast as I could, and Mac followed after. I got to the bridge running after her and saw her in the middle of literally barking at thin air. To say I was confused would be an understatement, as to say Daisy lost her mind as well. Suddenly, I noticed something approaching us from the other side of the bridge. It seemed to be a man, but he was insanely tall and wearing a large black coat. Daisy went crazy, barking at the guy and began chasing him. I looked back, and Mac was gone, but I didn't even notice he left. Everything happened so fast. As I turned around, Daisy went to bite the guy, but as she got to him, he just disappeared. She was just as confused as me and came back to me. We ran to the front of the park to find Mac, ask him where he went and if he saw the guy. I also wanted to report him because he probably wasn't supposed to be inside. But Mac said he had no idea what I was talking about, and he never saw anybody. He just couldn't catch up to us when I was running after Daisy, so he went back. But I distinctly remember him being right after me and going onto the bridge with me. Soon after, I quit my job. It was just too much for me. I had the creeps every time I got to my job. I still do to this day, and have no idea what happened that night. I'm a ranger at the West Coast National Park. I have been for almost 10 years now. I've seen a lot of things at this job, but one event that I never told anybody about until now, because I always thought I was crazy. It was July of last year. I was working both shifts because I was in need of a serious vacation, and it fit my schedule, so I would finally have extra time off. During the day, I kept seeing this man, who seemed very familiar to me somehow. Everywhere I went, somehow, he seemed to be at the same place, and after a few hours, it became suspicious. I felt like he was following me or something. But then, that didn't make sense because I showed up after him, and I began to think he might be uncomfortable or thinking I was following him. But for real, every place I needed to be that day, he was there before me. I was getting quite creeped out and couldn't wait for the park to close for the night, so I would have some rest. My vacation was coming in just 2 days. We had closed the park off at 11 that night, and by midnight, almost everything was done. We were ready to start wasting our time. At around 2 in the morning, I felt like taking a walk to get some fresh air. As I was walking, I began hearing footsteps behind me, but every time I would look back, there was nothing. Not even the wind was blowing because it was a hot July night, so I brushed it off. I thought I might be losing my mind or something. I continued my walk because I couldn't be bothered. But I only had passed a few meters before I heard a deep voice behind me asking me if I had recognized him. I quickly looked back, but there was no one there. I suddenly remembered the guy I was seeing today. It was my uncle. I had only seen him in photos and videos because he had died a few years before I was ever born. I will never be able to describe the fear I felt in that moment. Alone during the night, hearing footsteps and voices. I ran back to the guys, but I didn't tell them because they would definitely call me crazy. I've never told anybody about this until now, and to this day, I'm frightened of walking alone at night, as well as working night shifts. Niagara Falls State Park is located on the border of New York and Canada. It's a popular tourist destination, with people coming to see both the falls themselves and the wildlife in the park. But according to one ranger, it's also home to something far more sinister. The ranger, who wished to remain anonymous, told me that he's seen and encountered all sorts of cryptids in the park. He said that he's seen everything from giant snakes to werewolves, that each sighting leaves him shaken. I've been working here for years and I've never seen anything like it, he told me. It's like this park is cursed. He went on to say that there have been numerous cases of hikers going missing in the park, and that oftentimes their bodies are never found. It's as if they just vanished into thin air, he said. The ranger also told me about a cryptid known as the Wendigo. According to him, the Wendigo is a spirit that inhabits the woods near Niagara Falls. He said that it's a creature of pure evil, cannibalistic, and those who see it are usually driven mad by terror. I've seen it myself, he said. It's the most horrifying spirit you could ever see. It has razor teeth, eyes that burn with malice, and a deformed human shape. He went on to say that the Wendigo is responsible for many of the disappearances in the park, or so he believes, and that it's attracted to the fear of its victims. Everybody who goes into the woods, they're afraid, he said. The Wendigo feeds on that fear. He again described it as a tall, thin humanoid creature with long, claw-like fingers. He told me that when the Wendigo is hungry, it's known for preying upon lost campers and hikers in order to satiate itself. It usually kills them and eats their remains. Despite numerous sightings over the past few years, there have been no reports of anybody actually capturing footage. I don't feel it's safe to go into the woods. The Wendigo is always watching. Again, the ranger wishes to remain anonymous. As far as factual evidence of the Wendigo existing in Niagara Falls State Park, that is yet to be further concluded. This is my first time posting an experience of mine on the internet, so pardon any mistakes or errors I may make. I might not be the best storyteller, but this is one incident that I think needs to be shared to the world. So here I am. For context, I'm a ranger, currently stationed in one of the biggest national parks of North America, which I'm not comfortable naming here. I will tell you this, it's in the state of California. As part of the job, I'm required to stay inside for a major portion of the year. We have a dedicated space for residing rangers here, which isn't exactly luxurious, but gets the job done. We have the option for individual housing as well as a roommate arrangement, and the latter is the one that I currently have opted for. Bert, whom we'll call him, my roommate, is also my patrol partner, and we get along quite well. Now, ever since I became a ranger about 13 years ago now, I've had no experience which is out of the ordinary. My life had been extremely simple and peaceful until last week, when this occurred. We were just returning to the cabin from our post-dinner walk, which is pretty much a custom for us at this point. As rangers, we obviously don't need to walk since we're on our feet pretty much all day, but it's relaxing when it's not work-related, so we enjoy it. At this point, it was around 2 a.m. when we reached the cabin. Dinner time for us depends largely on the duties we were assigned for the day, so we can never have our meals at regular times. We were also facing a staff shortage at the park, which greatly increased the workload on all the existing personnel. Anyway, while Bert was unlocking the door, my wondering eyes noticed a figure standing near a large oak tree directly opposite to the cabin just a few yards away. When I tried to focus, the figure disappeared. Obviously, I chalked it up to my imagination. Why would somebody be here in the middle of the night anyway? Without giving it another thought or bringing this up with Bert, I went inside the cabin to call it a night. A few minutes later, while returning from the washroom, I saw the figure once more from my bedroom window. The tree is perfectly visible from the window, and the figure was right there where I'd seen it before. Again, it was only visible for about a split second, but this time, I got goosebumps for some reason. I felt like I was not imagining it, and someone was indeed out there. However, it wasn't plausible that a person could just vanish into thin air, so I told myself to calm down and sleep. Now, I'm usually a sound sleeper, but that night, I had trouble. I was tired from both the long day of work and the long walk we had. Yet, I kept tossing and turning in my bed, waiting for sleep to finally arrive. When I finally fell asleep, I was greeted by a nightmare. I don't remember all of it, specifically the starting or the build-up part, but I do remember the main part. I was standing near the tree, and I could see myself and Bert entering our cabin. I followed us inside, only to find me and Bert lying dead in the middle of our room. Our faces bloody, and our bodies extremely disfigured. I woke up in a cold sweat. Even though the room was really dark, I could make out the outline of a man standing near my bedroom door. Instantly, I switched my lamp on, but of course there was nothing. At this point, I was rather frightened. I did not feel sleepy anymore, but I needed the rest, so I decided to get up and heat up some water. Tea always makes me feel drowsy for some reason. In the kitchen, I found Bert at the dinner table, also having some tea. I asked him why he was up at 4 in the morning, and he answered by asking me the same question. We went back and forth for a while before he finally gave in and told me he had this lucid nightmare. Once again, I got goosebumps. I asked him what it had been about, and he described his dream in detail, which was exactly the same one that I had had. I couldn't believe it, and my expressions probably gave away the sheer terror I felt, because he asked me what was up. With some hesitation, I told him what was up. He chuckled at first, probably thinking I was mocking him, but when I mentioned the weird figure that I had been seeing out of the corners of my eyes, his expressions changed drastically. It turns out, he too had felt somebody was following us throughout our walk, but only had not wanted to say anything since he was tired and felt that he was only imagining it. Also, while entering the cabin, he thought he saw a hooded man inside, but when I had turned on the lights a second later, there had been nothing there. Something was definitely up, and I was panicking. Bert suggested we sleep after sunrise, since ghosts don't attack in the morning, which made me laugh. It was a childish suggestion after all, but in that moment, it sounded like a plan, so I agreed. However, sleeping was the least of our worries at that point. What did all this drama mean, and who had been following us? Anyway, around 5 a.m., my drowsiness finally came back. It was also bright outside now, so I felt more courageous than I had not long ago. I went straight to bed after wishing Bert a good night, and slept like a baby till about 3 p.m., when Bert woke me up for our shift. Nothing had happened since. I was admittedly scared to return to our cabin to sleep that night, but thankfully nothing happened. I don't know what to think of it. I would have managed to forget the incident if it hadn't been for today. Today, while driving to the cabin after the end of our shift, I felt like I saw the same figure in the rearview mirror yet once again. I haven't seen it since getting home, and I have not told Bert about it, but I'm scared and therefore I want my story out on the internet. If the dream becomes a reality, I'm pretty sure it would make headlines and you will all know that I am no more. If nothing happens and I survive the night, I'll update you about whatever happens tonight. If anything, until then, please, keep me in your prayers. I've worked as a ranger for nearly 20 years now, but I still cannot forget what happened on the 15th of October 2006. I joined the park just a few months before the weird, unlucky day, around the 22nd of August 2006. Some of the senior, older park rangers were still showing me the ropes at that time. They were very helpful and supportive most of the time, but they decided to pull a prank on me that day in October in the morning. My morning routine includes waking up super early, an hour more before my work shift, and then I run a few miles before coming back to the cabin, dedicated to the resident park rangers where I stayed. I would take a shower, then go eat with the rest of my colleagues before we went off on our assigned duties for that day or month. It depended on the task roster from day to day. Anyway, I woke up at 5:45. The sun hadn't risen yet, but there were more than enough light already by that time. I ran inside the deep part of the forest of the park area, so there were some spots that were not as lit up as the rest of the open sky. Anyway, a few minutes go by after I was already deep in the woods, and I heard a rustling behind me, like somebody was running with me. I slowed down my pace and turned around, but there was nobody, although I could still hear the rustle and light thuds as if somebody was matching my pace. I came to a stop and checked for the noise. It had stopped, just as I had. Well, I found that very strange. I called out and asked if anybody was there, and if they needed help, but it was all just my own echo that I had heard back. I shrugged it off once again and started running. The rustling and thuds became once more. It began to freak me out, because if this were any of my colleagues, they would have definitely made some noise or revealed themselves. But what frightened me the most was the fact that the thuds did not seem to be that of a human's to me. I picked up my pace and began to run quicker. In the blink of an eye, I saw a huge, black thing just cross me, jumping into the opposite direction of where I thought the noise was coming from. I felt like my heart would stop at any instant. I knew it was an animal, but I didn't know which, so I turned around and made my way back to the cabin. I slowed down in front of the cabin's wooden door and bent down on my knees to catch my breath. I glanced back, but I couldn't see anything, and it sounded a lot more awfully quiet. I thought I would ask the rest. That's when I opened the door, stepped inside, only to get a whole bucket of ice water dropped on me, followed by tomato ketchup and sauces. At least, that's what I could tell from how it looked and smelt. I heard a roar of laughter, shook my head and went to take a shower. At the breakfast, one of my fellow rangers at the time apologized for the prank they decided to pull on me. I told them it wasn't a huge deal. Then, he said he was apologizing for anything that would happen for the next day, and winked at me. I found it weird, but obviously that indicated they had something more planned. I went about my job. At night, I was walking back the same trail that I did every day back when I noticed small feathers hanging from the tree branches. They were red, but what made me the most intrigued was the fact that they weren't feathers of a real bird. It looked more like a toys or bird puppets, which meant there was a chance there was a kid there in the park, though it didn't make sense for one to be there. The feathers being there, just on that specific day, meant if it wasn't a kid, it was somebody else. I followed the trail of red feathers that ended up near a fallen log. There was a small featherless red puppet bird there indeed. When I picked it up, it was not red color. It was fresh red blood. I dropped it, looked around to see if there was anything else there, and that's when I saw a tiny hand poking out of the log. There was dried, muddied blood around the log. Immediately, I radioed it in, and all other rangers at the time rushed to the scene. They called the police, helped to push over the huge log, and found a young girl with claw marks all over her body. None of us had noticed it before, like I had mentioned, and I passed through that trail every day. But something was very different that day. The cops had told us the girl died close to about 20 hours ago, which spooked me, because that was when I had been out on my run and noticed the wild animal. I had reported that to the police, and they searched everything but could not find anything, including the identity of the girl. Even now, to my knowledge, the case remains unsolved, but what none of us could understand or try to explain was how, if the girl was killed that day, did something manage to lift a heavy log and put it over the girl in an attempt to hide it. No matter how we went about it, moving a big log was a movement we couldn't have missed. It should have been too noticeable for us rangers. It scared us, and even though we didn't talk about it after that day, I know what happened was real. Hi there. I've been listening to your content for quite a while now, and there is this temptation to write you about this strange event that happened just a few weeks ago. While I'm not a park ranger myself, I spend a lot of time outdoors because I'm a paddling instructor and a guide. I'm a 40-year-old woman. I work with people of different ages, teaching, guiding them, and sometimes mixing a little bit of tourism here and there. The academy I work for decided to offer short trips through places of historical importance as a way to entertain and educate students, consumers, customers, and attract more people. And one of the places we make excursions towards is Chickamauga National Park. For those who don't know, the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park are located in northern Georgia and southeastern Tennessee. They are known because it preserves two important sites that were both major battles of the American Civil War. The park itself does not offer excursions through its creeks. It is two, and both are by the boundaries of the park. Yet, the waterways are only accessible to people who paddle from outside the park. There were also events in the waterways during the war, and I often entertain people by telling them. The conflict was bloody, and there are lots of creepy stories about the spirits of dead soldiers, apparitions, ghouls, and other stuff happening there. I can't deny things sometimes seem eerie when you're alone there, but I normally hike in groups. Sorry for the long introduction, but I feel it's important to give context to things. One afternoon, we decided to go paddling towards the park with a bunch of my coworkers. We are just nature lovers and sports enthusiasts, so we like to go out on our own every once in a while. Just in case we returned around dusk, we made sure we had plenty of lights and lanterns on board for safety measures. It would only be a couple of hours, but there was no way we'd stay there until night hours. So, we began paddling on our kayaks through the water current, pretty much doing our stuff until we reached the park's area. I don't think I can explain this, but I felt a chill running down my back when we entered the park's territory. I'd feel creepy stuff hiking around the park, but never on boat. Since there were 4 of us, I just ignored it, and we kept advancing. The water made its noises, but after some time, I noticed things seemed strangely quiet on land at our sides. My people seemed to think the same, but nobody said it out loud. Do you know this collective sensation people get after spending years together? Well, we all got this sensation that something was off. After a couple of moments, one of my rangers started to make a noise, and we immediately looked towards where she was looking. What we saw was this strange person staring at us by the edge of the water flow. Its hair was long. At first, I thought it was an androgynous-looking boy. His teeth were long and pointy, just like an animal's. But the scary part were the eyes, glaring, and a very greenish-orange color, and shiny, and clever. I immediately understood that whatever he was, or whoever he was capable of intelligence. Now, one of my colleagues, a 55-year-old man, gave the signal, and we began paddling out of there. Didn't stop to return after an hour or so. We just wanted to make sure we wouldn't meet that thing again. We returned with our flashlights on and saw nothing, but nothing will erase the chill we felt when we saw the old green eyes. We'd often joke about the ghost stories, since we're quite skeptical, but what we saw that day is something that nobody will bother to decipher, and it's better that way. Hi, my name is Kevin. Not my real name, of course. I'm 32. I work as a ranger, and I work in a park in southern Argentina. Excuse my English. Its name makes reference to the glaciers there, on the Austral Andes Mountains, close to the national border of Chile. People are allowed to camp there, as long as they follow the rules. Some don't do it, and depending on the type of behavior visitors show, we can solve the problems ourselves or end up calling for the army. If somebody gets lost or injured, it's up to us or the army going inside to help them. We spend a lot of time outdoors, weeks and months, and I remember one particular event that happened a few years ago. We had a new ranger, a young woman who was in her later 20s. I was left in charge of showing her around. You see, while most of our jobs involve hiking and parking, We have cabins where we rest and keep a couple of bicycles around just in case we need to move around, without the need of noisy transportation. So, one afternoon, we received news of people lighting a small bonfire which is strictly forbidden inside the park. I got dispatched to go see what was going on with the new girl. We'll call her Mariana. We contact the people, a family, and first, but kindly, later firmly tell them not to do it. We want to avoid all wildfires. I remember one of the boys, of around 18 or 19, stared at Mariana and got this weird feeling, but we ignored him. We eventually returned to our steps and kept on with our routines until night. I remember having this weird dream, as if I was another person seeing the cabin from the outside, walking around and trying to see through the windows. In the dream, I walked towards the cabin, trying to open the door but could not. We always locked it down during the night. Some strange and creepy people just happened, and then looking at the chain bicycles. Cue the next day, and I remember feeling weird and telling the dream to my colleagues. There were 4 of us at the cabin at the time. When I got out to open the door, I see fresh footprints on the earth. Feeling a strange sensation, I walked back towards where people would keep the bicycles, and we see somebody broke the padlock with a large stone and stole a purple one, the same one Mariana used. I immediately told my team about it, and another guy and me immediately got to approach the family camping. They were gone, but Mariana's bicycle was by the place they left. The family also had a daughter and a little boy. They did not seem like the type to steal things nor go walking at night like some sort of stalker. I don't know. Something about that teenager seemed ugly to me, and the way he, because I'm sure it was him, not the parents, came towards our cabin at night and precisely stole the bicycle. I don't know, but I got these stalker vibes I didn't like. People have to follow their intuitions. We returned with the bicycle and used the radio to contact the personnel at the entrance to make sure the family left the national park grounds with all its members together. And this is not a paranormal story, but a real one. Be careful when you are outdoors. Sometimes, the dangerous stuff isn't as ghostly, but of real-life people. I mean, we all know Mariana can handle herself in bad situations. She knows a lot about self-defense. But sometimes, strange people just happen. Be careful when you're out there. No matter what country, what place, always keep your guard up. When I was a little boy, my father had me join the Boy Scouts in the youngest group. He was the outdoor type person, and he had many different jobs, all revolving around being in nature. He was also a soldier in the army, a drill sergeant afterward, and a park ranger when he got older. Naturally, he wanted me to follow in his footsteps, so the first stop was the Boy Scouts, just to get me used to spending time in the wilderness and learning to care for myself. I'll admit it, I enjoyed those years, and he managed to awaken the desire inside me to want to join the army, just as he had intended. He passed a year ago, and my final step of career life was to honor him by doing the same thing he did. I became a ranger at the White River National Forest in Colorado. This national forest is huge, and there are hundreds of rangers employed, stationed on all different sides of the forest. There are also dozens of trails and creeks that you can hike over, and the scenery here is breathtaking, to say the least. In fact, it is so beautiful that many people try to stay there overnight and get lost from time to time. That's where we come to help them. Camping here is prohibited in most areas because there are several dangerous animals roaming free, like bears and bobcats, but some people don't want to listen to the warnings. Some of us carry tranquilizer pistol with us, in case there is an attack, so we can safely try and put the animal to sleep. One particular night, I was doing my tour of the forest, checking if there are people in forbidden places, when I heard a noise very far from my position. It sounded like somebody was hitting a tree or shaking it. It was an unusual sound, but lumber thieves have tried to steal some wood here in the past as well. So, I decided to check out the noise. The sound stopped after a couple of seconds, but I kept walking in the direction of where I had last heard it. After about a minute of absolute silence, a flock of black and white birds soared to the sky out of nowhere, beginning to fly away. It looked like they were startled by some other animal. I knew the dangers of going through these parts alone at night, but I decided to keep going slowly forward, hoping to see what could have spooked the birds. Now, before I got close enough to the place where the birds took off from, I noticed the thing that startled them. At first, I thought it was a large bear. From behind, I could only see it crouching on all fours, with its head pointed towards the ground. Its back was covered with long hair, much longer than bears usually have. I slowly reached out for my tranquilizer, just in case if the animal notices me, and tried to back away without making a sound to disturb it. I managed to get some distance from it, but then the most unfortunate thing happened for a situation like this. I got careless, stepping on a dry twig in the grass, and it cracked under my heavy boots. As soon as the twig cracked, I could hear the animal growling, and I knew it was aware of my presence. I was prepared to face a bear and put him to sleep. But what I saw next, I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. The hairy thing in front of me definitely wasn't a regular animal that you can see in the zoo. It got up from its crouching position and elongated its spine. It was now standing at about 10 feet tall with its arms as long as tree branches. The creepiest thing about it is that it did not have paws like what you would expect it to. It had gigantic hands and feet with fingers on them, like a huge human or a monkey. It pointed its nose upwards like it was trying to smell its prey. I was utterly terrified by seeing this thing, and my instincts took over. My body chose flight instead of fight, and before I knew it, I was running as far from this creature as I could. While my body was running on autopilot, my mind was trying to comprehend what I had just seen. The creature reminded me of one of the legends called Sasquatch. It looked like a humanoid monkey with arms and legs, but without a tail. It was hairy all over, and getting extremely close to me. With every step it took, I could feel the ground shaking. As soon as I realized it is impossible for me to outrun this creature, I turned, shot a tranquilizer at it. The dart landed in its arm, but it was not enough to put this humongous creature out. I began running away again, reloading the gun along the way. I shot 2 more, this time in its legs, and I could see they were slowing it down, at least. I shot my final dart at its chest and continued to run as fast as possible. After a minute or two, I no longer felt like I was being followed. I finally had a chance to slow down and catch my breath. I made my way back to the station and spent the next hour reading articles online. I tried to spend as much time as possible finding as much information as I could about the thing that I saw. And after an hour of scrolling and reading, I am convinced the creature I indeed saw was a Sasquatch. Its physical appearance matched the descriptions and sightings of other people's reports perfectly. I also came across a blog article of a man claiming he encountered one in the Rio Grande National Forest, which is just a few miles south of where I was originally stationed. After that night, I always keep my walks around in the forest short and as close to the station as possible. I've been working as a park ranger for about 10 years now. It's the best, and also the only job I've ever had. I knew that I wanted to become a ranger since I was very young, as my dad was one as well. It was so clear that this was more than just a job for him. He loved every minute of it. So I wanted to feel that same joy when working. So many people go through life doing a job they absolutely despise. My mother, well, she's a great example of that. She works as a teacher, hates every minute of it. My dad passed away during my first year of being a ranger. I knew he was very proud of me. In general, the job is amazing. However, some things have happened that weren't very pleasant, and sometimes even scary. I'm not going to lie. I'm pretty fit and strong, but I get spooked very easily. My mom is a very superstitious woman, and I guess I've picked that up from her. Sometimes it's small things, like weird objects showing up in places where they don't belong, or strange sounds coming from within the woods. This story, however, is particularly strange and scary. I have no way of explaining it to anybody. This happened 6 years ago, as I was walking all by myself on a hiking trail in the park that I was working in at the time. It was very quiet around, and it was already pretty late at night. There had been a storm the night before, so I was out to clear the trails before a lot of large branches and other objects had fallen down. They could potentially get somebody hurt. It was my duty to give tours and take care of campers and hikers, so this was part of my job. I had to make sure that visitors were safe at all times. I enjoyed the task, as it was quiet and pretty warm outside. After a little while, I heard a very high-pitched scream coming from in the woods. You can't imagine how much that scared me. It went from being completely silent and quiet to this sudden strange and loud noise. This was not an animal. This was a person. It took everything inside of me not to run away as fast as I could. But I figured that maybe somebody was in danger. The sound came from far away, pretty deep in the woods. I didn't feel like it was very safe to go where the sound came from, but I had to figure out who that was coming from and why they were screaming. As I walked closer and closer to where I had heard the sound, I heard loud thumps coming from behind me. It sounded like a very large person walking. When I turned around, there was nothing there. I had no idea what was going on, but it's safe to say that I was mortified. It took me a couple of seconds to gain some courage and keep on walking towards the sound. Just when I was about to call out for the person to make sure that I was walking in the right direction and to ask them what was going on, I heard the same high-pitched scream right in my ears, as if somebody was standing right there. I had never been that terrified in my life. I feared for my life at that point. That was the moment I decided it was not worth it, and ran straight back to where I had come from. I ran for my life. This was not the best decision, though, as I tripped over a big branch that was lying there. It was dark out, and aiming the flashlight to the ground as I was sprinting away was not the easiest thing to do. I fell face first onto the ground, but could not even feel the pain. My adrenaline was that high. So, without thinking, I jumped back up and began running again. I could not bring myself to even walk a little bit slower to make sure I did not fall again, because I had to get out of there. When I was almost back at the hiking trail, my heart sank. The same scream was now coming from right in front of me. It was sure coming from somewhere on the trail. I didn't know how that was even possible. There was no way that whoever or whatever that was able to get faster than me. I stopped right in my tracks. I did not know what to do at that point. So, I decided to walk slowly towards the trail to see if there was something out there. I could not see anything, and I somehow found the courage to point my flashlight towards the trail. I was relieved. Nothing was there. When I lifted the flashlight higher to see the other side, that relief completely faded. I could see somebody standing behind a tree, a small but slender figure. When I walked onto the trail to get a better look, as soon as I pointed the light up to its face, it turned off. It was only for a couple of seconds, but when it turned on again, it was gone. I say it because I don't know what it was, but I know it was not human. I'm very certain that it wasn't. I have never been so terrified in my life before. I quit working in that park the next week. I just could not shake the fear. I was scared that it would happen again. Nothing weird has happened when I was working in the new park. I still work there now. I actually moved away because where I'm working now was too long of a drive away from my home at the time. That's just how terrified I was. I was working as a forest ranger up here in Anchorage when this happened. My job at the time was to patrol the remote areas of the park, make sure nobody ever lit fires they weren't supposed to, or throw litter when they weren't supposed to. I was equipped with my own radio and rifle with me at all times, in case I had to deal with any squatters or crazy people who came in the woods looking to do bad things, or maybe camping out at night illegally when they weren't supposed to. It was just before midnight on a Friday evening. I had been patrolling an area called Barney Creek. I hadn't noticed anything unusual happening, so I wasn't expecting anything like that later that night. But then, I found a deceased person, a skeleton. More on that in just a second. On my way back to my car is when I saw this body lying across the trail that I'd been walking on. At first, I thought it was maybe an animal. This is due to the condition that the body was in. But as I got closer and looked again, I realized it wasn't a bear corpse or any other animal. This is because there was no fur covering its flesh. It had obviously died for quite a while ago. After shining my flashlight around the area more thoroughly, with a sense of growing apprehension, tapping into whatever bravery might be needed, I slowly approached the remains, took out my camera before beginning to take pictures of the evidence. I was in no way prepared for what I saw when I moved much closer to take a look. The skull. It was pretty badly rotted, and there appeared to be a bullet hole right behind the left eye socket. Some brutal execution must have also happened, maybe even torture, judging by how bony and ripped out their chest area looked, without flesh, or what was left, covering up the ribcage. Whoever they were, somebody wanted them dead, and couldn't accept any opposition from whoever they were going after. This meant that whoever killed them was still around, and they'd be coming back. They could have been waiting out for me in the forest, possibly planning to take out their sick revenge on me. I had one mission: to get out of there as soon as possible and alert the authorities for backup. I had to run back as fast as I could, which was hard with how freaked out and terrified I was, still getting lost and occasionally trying to remember. Every time a branch or leaf would brush against me, I just suspected it was something that could kill me now, kind of like a monster's claw reaching up from behind bushes, ready to grab me by the neck and snap it like a twig. My heart raced with so much fear that I swear it was almost going to pop out of my chest without any warning at all. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I managed then to get away, but just collapsed onto the forest floor, completely exhausted. As soon as morning had arrived, I was successful in returning to the area, but the remains were gone. I couldn't tell if somebody had come in and taken them, or maybe some animal decided to bury their body under some dirt or leaves until fully decomposed. In any case, it didn't matter much because no one was going to find out who killed that person. But I realized afterwards, whoever did it might have been looking for me too. It's best not to say anything about my experience now while I'm still working as a ranger. Look, I don't know what happened, but here in Alaska at night, those skeletal remains still haunt me. I have never seen a cadaver in that bad a condition. But all I can say is, why didn't everybody just stay away from this area? Why did this happen? Who was this poor soul that got killed? It definitely looked malicious, like somebody had just left the body there. I mean, that's kind of obvious. Had it been an animal, it would have been eaten on, torn apart. But the body had been there for a while, and there were no signs of any animals even touching it. How strange, almost paranormal, if you will. I am a 20-year veteran in the Forest Service. I've worked as a ranger now for 12 years in my time. And in all my time working for the government, I've never encountered anything out of the ordinary. That is, until my last station job as a ranger at Gooseberry Falls State Park in Minnesota. It was quite possibly one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had while on duty, and certainly not something I'll ever forget. Well, to explain how it happened, we need to go back about 6 months. Before that incident, I had been planning on retiring. My son had just graduated college and was looking to move closer to Minneapolis. So, once he made the offer that he would work part-time with me while he looked for a full-time position, I decided to pass up retirement and stay on the job. By the way, I should make a note that this was all pre-COVID. I had heard rumors of management positions opening up in the area, so after discussing it with him, we both agreed that he would come back home for around 6 months, while I waited for the opportunity to present itself. I was first introduced to Gooseberry Falls State Park during my orientation as a ranger there, and they took us out into the park at nighttime. It was an amazing sight, getting to see all these bright campfires down below from way above on top of the waterfalls. The rocks around the falls are very smooth and slippery due to years and years of erosion. You have to be careful if you want to climb down to view the falls at night. Our group had just finished our tour and was going to head back towards our cars when one of my coworkers, Tom, suggested that we climb down the falls, just, for the sake of it. I agreed, and we should have known better, and so did a handful of others who were nearby. As soon as we began climbing down, I sensed something wasn't right, but being fearless, I pushed those feelings aside as nothing more than nerves. It started out easy, everyone traveling downward in a single file behind each other, staying close and yet far enough apart for safety's sake. Then, around 3/4 of the way down, the things began to get a bit more dangerous. Tom fell. I didn't see him do it, but I heard the commotion. One of my other coworkers had seen what had happened, yelling up to us that he needed help getting Tom back up the rocks. 2 guys rushed down to assist in whatever way they could, and while Tom was being helped back up, one of my female friends called out for help above him, saying she was slipping. It turns out that one part of the path she had been walking, had gave way underneath and sent her tumbling downward. While this may have been scary in and of itself, what happened next could only be described as something straight from a horror movie. We're all standing there in shock at what had just happened, when I heard the sound of movement. I looked up, and there, at the top of the ridge, was this figure with long dark hair, watching me. It was terrifying. It was in all black, and had these faint yellow glowing eyes. It was in that moment that I felt my entire body give way, as if I suddenly lost control. The next thing I knew, I too was falling down to the grounds below me. Everybody rushed over to help save me, and one guy managed to grab hold of my hand while another wrapped his arms around one leg, for whatever little good that did. They tried pulling me back up, but it was no use. I looked down below, and I could see there were people trying to help my friend, though they weren't having much success. I knew then that we were all going to die right here on these rocks if somebody didn't do something fast. That's when I remember the park ranger telling us about one of the waterfalls in this area, called Lucifer Falls, which, for some reason, nobody had ever been able to find after climbing down to view it at night. It was said that once you get close enough, you could hear voices, supposedly spirits, whispering your name from below. Now, what is most troubling about this story is not so much what happened to me and my coworkers, but what happened with Tom and the female friend as they were being pulled back up to safety. Before either of them can make it out of the water completely, we noticed that their eyes had turned from their normal state into a solid black. It was like at this moment that my 2 coworkers realized that they were struggling with weren't actually Tom or the girl. I'll never forget hearing one of them scream as he pointed downwards towards whatever our friends had become. The other one, just before Tom and his girlfriend can pull themselves completely up onto the rocks, let go with both hands, jumping back down into the water below to avoid capture. We watched him swim off in the opposite direction, but by this time, there was nothing we could do to save him. We never did find out what happened to any of them after that day. I can only assume they were captured and are now being used for some sort of test subjects, for whatever their reasons may be.
Just looking at my own hands now, I can still see the long dark hair growing in them, like I saw that day. That's why I'm warning you all not to venture down this path at night. As a matter of fact, it might be best just to stay away from these woods entirely during nighttime hours, like we should have. Whatever it is that inhabits these lands does not seem too keen on having people wandering around here at night. But if you are, be careful, for you may soon find the woods themselves can't tell the difference between friend and foe. I suppose it is expected that anybody who chooses to follow in the footsteps of Smokey the Bear would be possibly stuck in a few scary situations. That certainly was the case for me as I spent my nights working alongside park rangers on some of the most dangerous and terrifying trails in the States. It's not what one might think about being a ranger, though. We don't spend every day sitting around watching deer graze or children play in the playgrounds. Instead, what happens behind those locked gates is something more akin to horror movies than a picnic. If you manage to find your way through these wooded corridors without being eaten alive by some wild animal or eaten after a bear, you could end up with some serious psychological damage. As my first summer as a ranger was coming to an end, I decided that I wanted to spend one last night in the woods alone. Not many rangers do that kind of thing anymore, but for me, it was sort of this cleansing ritual. My girlfriend had just broken up with me at the time, and I needed time to work through that emotional trauma. I knew there were other people who understood my pain. They would be likely willing to talk about the world ending when we got close enough in proximity. But every man needs his space from time to time, even if he is working with the confines of the law. To be honest, I wasn't really sure where to expect to be out there in the woods with no one else around. I had been alone quite a few times before, but never running into any real trouble. But this time, my mind was racing through the worst-case scenarios, and it almost felt like fate that I would get caught up in some kind of adventure by myself. Either I was going to find somebody who could relate to all my situation, or perhaps even fall for them as they helped me through it all. Anyway, I made it to the trailhead, eventually, and began hiking down towards it to my favorite spot at Lake Oroville State Park. The entire park is beautiful, located not far from Sacramento. But until you are actually standing deep within its borders, you can't truly grasp its beauty. I loved watching the weather roll in over the water, feeling the cold air as it rushed past my face and into my lungs, waking me up from a lazy afternoon nap. I felt at peace with myself every time I visited this spot, but not so much that other people bothered me. That's why this was almost certainly going to be a good night. I had just crossed over one of the small bridges leading across the lake when I heard something rustling behind me. More similar to low growls than anything else, really. It sounded like something was stalking towards me, perhaps a bear. The only thing about these sounds that didn't scream bear were its frequency. They were more sporadic than I would have expected. My ears picked up this distinct sound of footsteps, more than once actually, as if somebody were running towards me, directly through the thicket. Not wanting to meet with whatever was out there on my own terms, I scrambled for one of the trees and threw myself up into it to try and hide. Unfortunately, jumping back had cost me more time than I realized, and by the time that I reached around and grabbed hold of a branch, something hit me hard right in the side. You know, it feels like forever before I felt like landing against something soft and squishy. It wasn't exactly warm or inviting, so all of those other feelings must just be an illusion, brought on by adrenaline. It only took a single moment for me to realize what had been happening. That I had been wrapped at the ankles, waist, shoulders, and neck in some kind of netting. I didn't know what exactly it was made out of, but it wasn't rope. It was some sort of binding material. My hands were then completely immobilized by entanglement as well, so there wasn't much I could do other than struggle against my bonds. A dead-end endeavor, if there was ever one. Now, the first thing I noticed when I could finally see again is it was completely dark around me. All light coming from behind with only blackness ahead. 2 dim lights appeared along the walls on either side of me and began approaching slowly as my eyes would now adjust. They were really more like natural animal eyes than any sort of man-made illusions. Even worse, I noticed that the blackness ahead of me wasn't really coming from a lack of light at all. Instead, there appeared to be some kind of organic wall blocking out my view, spreading out across the room to each side. I had no idea how large this place was, but it must have been bigger than what I could see. One behind me and another in front of me. They made themselves known moments later. Footsteps. The noises were too far away for me to make out at first, but then I could hear they belonged to something, and more than 2. Now at this point, fear began gripping my heart as I lashed out against my binds once again, only to find they hadn't been loosened in the slightest, or so I thought. We'll get to that in a moment. I was hauled from my small prison by several sets of long clawed hands that dragged over what appeared to be some kind of altar. It wasn't much different from one of those sacrificial altars, appearing to be used in ancient times for rituals meant to appease unworldly beings who were said to lurk within the space between 2 worlds. But this one seemed more like a place where people got together for satanic worship or other unholy activities. These beings holding me lured me down onto it and began weaving this sort of flower all around me while chanting something in this ungodly language. I was so terrified, I swear I could have had a heart attack. I couldn't make out all the words, but I had no idea what this thing was or what they were saying. The entire group of these things began chanting in unison as they surrounded me, continued weaving more of this plant material around me. It felt like forever before they finally got to the last one. All I could do was just lay there on my back, completely immobilized by flowers, while these creatures circled around me once and turned their backs towards me. The chants stopped abruptly, and every creature but one turned to leave. The remaining one tossed this mask aside, revealing a set of devilish features underneath it. What I had been dealing with looked like a combination of wild feral human beings and kind of goblinish people. You know what it kind of reminded me of? The trolls or orcs in Lord of the Rings. Humanoid, feral looking, but also not human. That's what they reminded me of. It stood there, shaking its head from side to side, slowly with its arms raised upward as I tried to break free. Now, again, I cannot reiterate how terrifying this was. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I was convinced in that moment I was about to be sacrificed by some sort of under-cave dwelling creatures. I was so scared beyond belief. Then, this thing pulled its arm down, after shaking its head, and walked away. Completely immobilized, I tried my best to get out of my entrapment, and I believe it was the massive amounts of adrenaline exploding through my entire being that allowed me to break free. As I did, though, I could hear these things coming back, and I knew I had to escape as quick as I could. Once fully free, I started to run for it, escaping in just a matter of time, feeling my way out of this black organic labyrinth. I don't know if I was in a cave or what this was, but as I reflect back on these memories, I had so much flooding through my mind, I feel like I kind of blacked out. I don't really know if I remember much after that, but I do distinctly remember collapsing on the ground and being found later on, I know, that's probably very anticlimactic, but when the human body endures that kind of trauma, stress, it does things to the brain that aren't exactly normal. Anyway, I was treated at the hospital, ultimately taken back to the station, and sent home. I didn't actually believe what I experienced at first. I thought it was some crude nightmare or horrible hallucination. But it wasn't until later that I realized it must have been something that really happened, because I actually had biting marks around my ankles, my thighs, my waist, and my wrists. Those bindings were on tight, and I must have wiggled free enough that I loosened them. Like I said, whatever the bindings were this crude rope vine material. I've never seen it before in my life. None of them really believed me, though, when I actually got a chance to describe what happened. They thought I was either making it up or just had a bad nightmare. As you can probably bet, this incident has been difficult for me. At any rate, this is my story, and I hope you can get enjoyment from a real-life traumatic event. I don't care if you believe me, and if you choose to read this, which, by the way, you have permission to, I don't care if your readers believe me. I know there's something out there that lives underneath the ground, something that isn't quite human. It was on a hot summer night that I was out in the dark woods with my neighbor, whom I'm pretty close with. He was like extended family, honestly. The fact that I didn't even know we were going until that night when I was sitting at home in front of my laptop, playing video games. My neighbor came over to see me, and he asked me if I wanted to go camping with him and his family. It had been a while since we last did anything together, so of course I said yes. It would have just given us an excuse not to go to school for a couple of days. This was in September, so school had just started back up, and the coldness of fall had not yet come, so it was perfect. The next day, his family and I gathered our camping gear. We're driving down a dark road with tall trees on either side of it. It was getting dark quickly, so we had to turn the lights on, and unfortunately, which means we would have had to set up in the dark. So we're driving for about an hour or two, but it felt like it took forever. My friend's dad turned left at an unmarked intersection, where there wasn't even a sign saying that this was the right turnoff. The road got bumpy and rocky as he drove over this very raw, unpaved road. That's when we came across a large clearing, because all I could see around me was trees and darkness, where we stopped at this makeshift campground. I say that because there was no clear indicated spot to set up a tent, a spigot, a bathroom, or anything. This was truly camping just out in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. Now, I need to say that it was pitch black out, and it had gotten really cold now that the sun had set. We were also higher up in elevation, so we got everything set up quickly and decided we would huddle up in the tent together that my friend's father had set up for us. But I just had this feeling lingering within me that we weren't alone. Now, my brain was playing tricks on me, so I decided to step out and get some fresh air. It was eerily quiet until I heard this screaming noise. My heart began pounding fast, as if it knew what was coming. Then we heard a rustling noise in the bushes, more screaming from the woods. I was so scared that my friend told me to come back into the tent now. Not only could we all hear the noises, but then, as I got back in the tent and we shined our light, we could see something moving outside the tent. This shape. My friend's dad got a flashlight, shining it too at this object. That's when this thing began screaming and thrashing. Now we're all yelling, freaking out, because we can see the shape of this thing more. It looked like an animal, but all we could see was this large shape, and it was terrifying looking. From the silhouette, it looked like an upright, deformed reindeer or something, and it had long claws. Were we being pranked? I wasn't even sure. It screamed again in our direction, and we just prayed for it to leave. It walked around our tent, and we all kept our flashlights shining at it through the tent material, only revealing its silhouette. But one thing I noticed is it never came closer to the tent. It's like it was pissed that we set up camp here in its area. I get it. This probably sounds like some sort of amateur creepypasta, but tell that to my family, my friend's family, and me, who have to deal with the memory of this thing. We stopped hearing it, almost literally, after we all pretty much urinated all over our sleeping bags out of terror. Surprisingly, none of us had any weapons on us. Somehow we all forgot. We got lucky that night, but who knows what would have happened if it were to come back, and possibly check out our tent. Now, of course, my friend's dad regrets that he didn't bring any weapons. He forgot. He normally always carries a pistol. I went home the next day, and we didn't get any sleep that night. What was designed to be a several-day trip turned into a quick overnight terror. I've not been able to go camping since. I don't think I ever will. And I'm also not sure what this thing was or where it came out of. I haven't really sat down to try and research either. I don't really care. I just want to get rid of this memory. I had been working as a forest ranger for almost 5 years. A ranger's day could consist of anything from collecting firewood to tracking down missing hikers. And my day began like most. I would wake up early, walking into work, grabbing my binoculars. As I was about to drive out of the forest, I got a call. That day, I was given a new assignment. I met up with another colleague, a fellow ranger, and we went to the center of this area where somebody had been reporting hearing strange screaming coming from around a cave system nearby. My partner and me decided that I would be able to handle it by myself. He had other things to do, and this was just another run-of-the-mill investigation for me. After he left, I headed towards that area where there had been several unreported mounds to this cave system. Now, let me give you some information. This cave system runs pretty deep, and there are guided tours, but I also know that this cave system is very expansive, and also having a lot of unidentified entrances and holes that can lead deeper into the system. These are also off trail, so myself, I've never actually experienced finding more of these, although I know hikers have reported finding many, and even leaving makeshift markers to let other hikers know this was an entrance. Parts of the ground here were also dangerous, meaning if you step on the wrong part, the ground below you could collapse, falling into a tunnel. So I had to be very careful about how I approached this entire search. The good news is, I wasn't hearing any screaming, so that could be good or bad news. The bad news meaning the hiker or whoever was stuck there could have been deceased or what. But the good news being that maybe the hiker had gotten themselves out. Anyway, my heart was pounding just by the sheer adrenaline of it. I didn't know why, but something told me to run. It was this feeling in the pit of my gut. As soon as I got there, right around the cavern system, the wind picked up, and everything seemed colder than it already was. A gust. Now, I could have begun my investigation in the main entrance, but as I was planning, I heard the scream. It sounded like a person, but they were maybe a couple 100 feet away, north. So I marched through the trees, looking, following the source of the screaming, yelling out, "Can you hear me? Can you respond?" And the screaming ceased. I followed along the rock wall and found this crude hole in the ground, maybe no larger than 5 feet. It was right by a rotted tree stump with only one branch on it. This, I knew, probably went down into one of the cave systems. This, by the way, was probably no more than 200 feet away from the main entrance. After crouching down, I was able to slide down at a 45-degree angle into this cave system, landing in a small chamber that I think connected to the others. I always carry a flashlight with me, so I took it out and turned it on. As soon as I did that, the caves plunged into darkness as my battery instantly died. That's when I heard a loud crash. I turned around, or I should say, turned to meet the noise, and my flashlight popped back on. There, like out of some sort of sick Stephen King novel, was this grotesque figure, large black eyes covering its entire body, stretching its arms out and moving toward me. And terrified, I wanted to turn and run, but didn't have time, as there was another one of these beings coming from the opposite side of the cave, approaching. I turned as fast as I could and fled up the 45-degree incline about the cave. Just as I was turning to climb up, I could hear a third one approaching from directly behind me. Now I had one coming from my left, my right, and behind me. This one, as I turned and looked, was larger than the other two. Completely terrified out of my mind, and the sounds of screaming were now apparent, coming deeper in the cavern. I don't know if it was an injured hiker, or if these things were making the noise, luring anybody into this tiny crevice, this chamber into the earth. Like I said, the opening to this cavern wasn't large, but I never in a million years would have expected to find things like this. This was horror movie status. I didn't tell anybody else about what I found, and kept it to myself. After climbing out of that hole, I ran, and I ran, and I ran some more. Getting back to the station later on, I didn't say a word. I knew the other rangers wouldn't believe me. And what would I tell them? That I found a cave full of half arachnids, half creatures? I mean, they'd probably think I was crazy. Now, I've kept this secret for a while, but how long can I keep it from the rest of the world? Will my story ever be told to other people? Or should I just stay quiet about what had happened? Let me just apologize and say, I'm sorry for the formatting of this story. I'm a terrible writer, and I am not a storyteller, so I'd apologize in advance. But these creatures that I saw were unlike anything I've ever seen. They really reminded me if you crossed a tarantula with a human. I mean, these were gross. They made this hissing, clicking noise too. I know it sounds phony through email, but it's really hard for me to convey emotion properly, at least through written communication. With all the information coming out anymore about missing hikers and seeing strange figures and shapes in the woods, and all the other bizarre happenings of 2020, I figured, hey, maybe now is an okay time to be open about my experiences, and hopefully not experience backlash. I was patrolling my usual forest trails at night. I've been a ranger for 8 years now, and nothing had ever scared me as much as this one experience that I encountered, well, what I think was a Bigfoot, doing my routine patrol on this night. It all started with me, walking along the same trail I do at night to do my rounds. Being Florida, it had rained earlier in the day, so everything was calm and peaceful, minus the puddles of mud here and there. The sun had set about an hour or two before, which meant it was exceptionally dark outside, although I was already used to this. The moon was barely out. I saw a few other rangers patrolling with me, but they had passed by, and somewhere out of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes later, I was walking along the dirt trail when I noticed something appeared in front of me. A dark, large figure coming from the right side of the path and then crossing in front of me as it headed off into some thick brush off to my left. Palmettos, actually. This is directly where I patrol, meaning there should most definitely not be anything even remotely close to resembling whatever this thing was. Its speed is what surprised me and took me off guard, considering it didn't even give me enough time to turn around and see what it looked like. All I could make out was that it was jet black, very tall, and easily taller than I was. It moved quickly. I didn't even have time to react until after it had already gone into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, deep in the palmettos. My heart sunk, and I felt an odd sensation. It was this incredible feeling of fear. All I can think about is how much more dangerous it had just made my job that night. If there was some large animal out here that moved fast, was taller than I and larger than I, that actually crossed paths with me like it did, what else might be lurking out here? Would it cross paths with me again? Was this thing actually looking for me? As I thought about it more, I considered the fact that if something was after me, then maybe whatever it was might be prepared to attack. Although I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I began getting angry. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I was a few hours away from my shift ending, and talking myself into returning to the station, telling myself that if I did, I would be safe. If this thing is out there, it's just as much looking for me as it is anybody else. So now more than ever, getting to my ranger station was my only priority. I didn't really know what it was or what to think about it, but there was only one way to find out, and that was by continuing my patrol. Now I stood still for a moment, debating with myself on whether or not I should continue. Remembering all the times going back home early had made me feel like a failure. Although I had never encountered anything like this before, it didn't mean there was nothing out there. It only means that whatever it was hadn't bothered me yet. But now that it had crossed paths with me, I might be next on this list of things to kill. That would have made me sick. The rest of my story is pretty uneventful. Unfortunately, after this, not a lot happened. I didn't see the figure again, and as I look back on this event and reflect, I believe I encountered a skunk ape, a Bigfoot, native to the Florida Everglades. While it was probably harmless and didn't want to actually hurt or kill me, it was still completely terrifying. I still don't know if this creature was real or not, but that didn't matter, regardless of what it actually is. I'm convinced that whatever it was, it wanted to hurt me, or so I had convinced myself, and still wonder. I honestly don't know how to explain what had happened to me. I believe I saw some sort of Native American entity. I was working as a ranger for the city of Austin, Texas. I just had one left of our reserve campsites when a very strange thing occurred. This was about 10:30 at night. I was driving my four-wheel drive pickup truck on a dirt road that led back to the entrance of the park. The area is a wooded hillside, spanning 200 acres, and contains a very large number of wildlife. So, being nighttime and how many animals are nocturnal, I was watching out for signs of their movement on either side of me. It was quiet, and I was the only one around. I had been following the road closely when I got this strong sensation. The road, everything around it, dense woods. I looked up just as a deer ran out in front of my truck, directly in my path. It was something like 40 yards ahead of me. When I saw it, I reacted immediately by pulling onto the shoulder, slamming my brakes. The deer now was only about 10 feet away from my truck when I swerved and it vanished. As soon as it went out of sight, the feeling that had told me to look up subsided. Everything went back to normal. There were no other cars on the road. Of course, being just mine, I sat in place, trying to collect my bearings. My heart was beating fast and I had a headache, and I couldn't explain these feelings. What on earth? So something brought my attention to the hillside, right where the deer had come from, and that's when I saw movement, about 50 yards into the brush. It wasn't clear. I got out of my truck to inspect, and walked up to the spot where I thought I had seen the movement through the tree line. The woods were pretty thick, but about 20 feet into them, there was a small opening and trees with lower branches, and ones that were not as wide or tall. They almost kind of formed a natural corridor that maybe, I'd say, 50 yards opened up to the hillside before becoming obscured by the other trees and foliage. The ground sloped slightly upward, many leaves. I called out with my flashlight, thinking, why would there be somebody out here? It didn't make any sense. Thinking maybe I was just seeing things, or it might be another deer. There was no answer, and that was it. I assumed it was just my own paranoia. Now, I didn't hear anything move past me, so I decided to inspect further, because why not? Calling out loudly, I knew, at least I'm pretty sure, I saw movement. And again, there should be no reason at all why anybody should be this far out here late at night. The movement I saw was more like a person, not a deer. At least, I'm sure of it. So I kind of very shortly walked up the hillside, never hearing a sound. I decided finally that okay, enough is enough. I'm going to leave and head back to my truck. As soon as I got in, I realized there was something wrong. Something strange and paranormal, if you will. As soon as I got back in my truck is when I saw it. Coming out of the woods ahead of me, slightly up from where the deer emerged, is what I can only unmistakably describe as an apparition. It was this glowing, translucent being, but unmistakably a spirit. It shimmered, seeming to be faint but nearly transparent. It came closer to my truck and appeared as if it were getting bigger, but also darker and more solid at the same time. It was this light grayish color and then would grow darker in color, kind of pulsating. It just walked right past the front of my truck, with no fear or concern about my presence whatsoever. It just walked by like nothing was there, with some kind of purposeful stride, without having so much as even a look of curiosity. And then, right there in my view, just vanished, fading into obscurity. Not wasting a second, I flew my vehicle out of there, and my only mission in that moment was to go, 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 go. Before this, I thought ghosts were a joke. I had never been a believer in the paranormal, or what many refer to as the spirit realm. But after this, that changed my mind. And I'll never forget what I saw, but it wasn't until the following morning when I really kind of fully mentally processed what I saw. Surprisingly, because I didn't sleep that much. But a thought occurred to me, and I realized what had really happened. What I saw looked like a stereotypical image of a native. Long hair, down to its shoulders. Feathers, a headdress actually. My professional theory is that somebody, a Native American, has gone through this road many times before in their lifetime, and they're simply showing me something that happened here at some point along the way. Maybe they stumbled upon these woods at night, and for whatever reason, they were killed on spot by first contact European settlers, who probably had no qualms about killing anybody different than them, including women and children. I do not believe this entity or spirit to have been malicious. It didn't come off as that. It was just something that happened to them in their lifetime. This spirit was merely doing whatever some non-physical thing does when in the process of trying to relive what happened. It's a possibility that this spot is where these people might have killed or injured in an altercation. Maybe they were stuck between this world and the next. I don't know. Maybe they've seen my truck hundreds of times out here late at night over the years, and now I'm able to pick up on whatever it happens to come through here. Who knows? Anyway, that's my experience with the paranormal. Hopefully, it will be my last.
Being a park ranger means being prepared for literally anything.
We often wear many hats and act as communication between lots of different service providers and even authorities. We can be search and rescue, doctors, ER doctors, police, teachers, and sometimes even parents. We always have our wits about us, or at least try to, and you get used to certain sights, sounds, and smells, depending on which branch of ranger you are. The search and rescue obviously deal with more grisly situations. Now, before I started this, roadkill would make me have, especially the smell on a hot summer's day. Whilst I by no means enjoy it, I'm just kind of used to it. I've seen hikers that have taken a fall, shins sticking up to their legs. I've seen arms and ankles bent the wrong way. Even a car crash that happened near us, that we were called in for extra assistance since there were parts all over the highway. That was bad, but at least there was a reasonable account for why I handed a CSI a part of the human body I was not able to identify. What I found one day on a seemingly routine check, way deep into the park where barely anybody goes, could not so easily be explained. One of the things I really enjoy most about the job is the freedom. Yes, we all have a role to play, but unless there is something specific going on, we can travel to any part of the vast parkland that was like and work in that area. I had chosen a remote location because of the very fact it seldom gets visited, and therefore, sometimes we are lucky enough to discover young over there, and varying different species. I wanted to see if there was anything new to log, especially any of our lesser populated animals. There isn't much of a proper trail out there. We do maintain some sort of pathway for the most part. It is kept for nature and overgrown. It's too far out for any adventurous school of scouting groups, and the majority of hikers head in the opposite direction. This was springtime and early morning, still fairly warm, and all of a sudden, the smell hit me. It wasn't super strong, but enough that I knew exactly what it was. Blood. Of course, I wasn't alarmed. We do have an occasional bear here and there, and other animals who stalk and eat each other. After all, this is the wild. However, what I was in no way expecting to find was a human hand nailed to a tree trunk. It had been hacked off at the wrist. I say that because this was not a clean surgical cut. The edge of the skin was raggedy, bits of tissue dangling off. The blood I could smell had pooled at the bottom of the tree, staining the ground this darkish brown color. The blood had coagulated and had been there at least a few days. There was a lot of fly activity, but nothing else had been along to nibble at it, so it seemed. Possibly because it was nailed about 8 feet off the ground. I, of course, called it in, and my boss called the police. We helped them do a full sweep of the area, but did not find any other body parts. They told us after doing a full investigation, nobody had been to any of the local hospitals with a missing hand. The prints and blood did not match anything on record. All they could tell was that it was a middle-aged white man. We'll never know how it got there. Why there was no other evidence like blood anywhere else, or footprints, tire tracks, and just how on earth it got nailed up that far onto the tree. We also now routinely check that area, just in case, keeping the pathways a little clearer. Nothing else has happened since, though. Thank God. I was helping to supervise a middle school overnight camping trip when something extremely terrifying happened. I'm a ranger, and oftentimes I help out with any educational or scouting groups. Kids can be great fun, and I have a lot of fun with them. Coming from a big family myself, I have a lot of experience with siblings and even younger cousins. Sometimes on these trips, one of the kids gets scared. Even as middle schoolers, the woods are dark and can sometimes make strange noises and add into the spooky campfire tales we like to lightly scare them with. It's no wonder that one or two of them end up with nightmares. And sometimes, especially if they are already spooked, their eyes can play tricks on them. One little kid was obviously upset and trying not to show it after listening to the famous dog licking your hand under the bed story. A short while, with everybody set up in their tents, there was a tap on mine, asking if I'd walk him over to the bathrooms. There is a creek behind them, which you know is pretty convenient. And all of a sudden, I heard a scream, and he came running back, saying he'd seen a figure. I told him to run back to the tents as I had a good look around. I couldn't see anybody, but a few moments later, I was joined by one of the teachers. When the kid had gotten back to the tents, he'd been so upset that he'd tumbled straight into the faculty tent, told them that somebody was trying to murder him. I told the poor member of staff that wasn't quite correct, what the kid had told me, that he'd seen a figure and that I'd made a sweep of the area. I couldn't find any trace of anybody being there, other than us. Still, just to be on the safe side, we reported it back to base. We always have extra staff on and somebody remains in the office when we have kids on site. And my colleague Joe was on all night long. He promised to make some routine checks. He let us know immediately if he saw or came across anything that might put the campers in danger. It was very much protocol, but we didn't think for a moment anything would actually happen. Even though I was 99.9% sure the kid had just imagined it due to spooky stories and the fact that it was so dark. It had still unnerved me. Maybe some of his fear had rubbed off. Now, I wasn't scared, but I did feel a sense of trepidation. Since I couldn't sleep, I sat on a lawn chair outside of my tent, keeping on my flash and being very glad of my Kindle. I stayed awake pretty much all night, waving at Joe every now and again as he passed by, being extremely grateful when he brought me another cup of coffee around 3 a.m. About 6 a.m.-ish, the kids began to wake up, and sure enough, soon there was a line needing to use the bathroom. I had not taken the kids this time, but suddenly, there was another scream, and so, naturally, I rushed over. This time, a little girl was flooding with tears, claiming she had seen a body in the water. I got the teachers to take all the children back to the site and pack up immediately. I radioed Joe. Then, I stepped around the back of the restroom block, over to the creek. Now that it was light out, I could see far better, and I could even make out that, yes, there was indeed a figure or a body in there. Quickly, I took a photo on my cell, radioed to Joe to cancel any 911 calls. The children and teachers were hysterical when I arrived back at camp. I called for all of them to hush, so I could explain what happened, but that we were ultimately safe. I then pulled out my cell, showed the faculty member in charge the photo I'd just taken. She looked at the boy from last night and the little girl who was still in tears and burst out laughing. "Come here, kids," she said, in that kind of firm but kind way only teachers seem to possess. They went over to her, and she showed them the photo, zooming in on the body. At first, they looked scared, then confused, and then finally relieved. I'm sure they'll see the funny side one day when they are older and less traumatized. Otherwise, they'll have to always be mindful when visiting. You see, floating in the creek was a large garden gnome. I definitely imagine it looked terrifying to the kid in the dark, even to the little girl in the morning, who had no doubt heard the rumors about a mysterious figure. We have no idea how this gnome ended up in the creek. The park isn't exactly a hot spot for fly tipping, and the nearest home is miles away. We kept him in the office afterwards, calling him Richie, after the kid who thought he was an axe murderer. Sorry this story isn't scary, but more funny than anything else. I work as a ranger out in Pennsylvania, and we have a very large cave system. We have to monitor this. Although the area is checked on fairly regularly, there are parts that are so remote, they probably have never ever been recorded. Like, unless we are actively doing a search and rescue, we don't head out there. So, when we report that something or cavers had been exploring and come across a crime scene, we aren't that surprised at all. Since they said there wasn't any bodies or injured parties, we headed over to check it out before filing our own report with the sheriff. What we found was really weird. First off, my buddy swore that he'd been in this particular cave before, but some of the items we found were years old, and I mean decades. There were old cans in there with expiry dates back from the 1970s. The crime scene the explorers had alluded to was actually a bloody shirt hanging on the wall of the cave. Again, it looked really old. Maybe not as old as the food cans, but certainly nothing recent. Further inspection came up with 3 more things. A human femur, clean with no marking, suggesting injuries. A well-read paperback book, a copy of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, published in 2003. And a word that had been scratched somehow onto the cave wall, probably with a knife or a jagged rock. It simply spelled out help. Of course, we called the police. They ran some tests, did some digging, but ultimately, it all led to a dead end. Pretty creepy though, especially the vast amount of time difference between the items. Old food cans from the 70s, and a book from a little over 15 years ago. Who needed help? And if they died in that cave, why was just a femur left? Where was the rest of them? I'm about 49 now, about to be 50, and I'm no longer in the Forest Service industry anymore, but I have some tales that will scare the hell out of you. I don't have time to sit down and write them all out, but there is one that comes to mind that I will share with you, since you seem to be obsessed with deep woods, park rangers, and strange things. The year was 1995. I'll never forget it. Mainly because I went through a lot of stuff that year. A divorce, both my parents passing, among some other personal tragedies and hardships I was forced to endure. But beside that, that was also the year I experienced some strange things while in the job. But more importantly, a good colleague of mine, who we became very close friends while we worked together alongside as rangers. While him and I both have our fair share of strange, creepy experiences, there's one that really sticks out that happened in June of 1995. I'll never forget it. I was out doing my rounds and I got a call over the radio. He told me that he was pretty sure he was being followed, and that he was being terrified, stalked by some large men. Of course, I radioed back, asking him what he meant. A little side note. My colleague, we'll call him David, since I won't be revealing his real name, was out in a section of the park that is much more secluded. In fact, there's no trails over there. There are no hikers. There's no camping. No reason for anybody to be back there. But I guess there had been some issues back there that our supervisor wanted him to go check out. After going there and seeing that there was no issues at all, which the original issue was, I believe my supervisor was under the impression there was a small campout, or possibly a homeless camp. I'm not exactly sure. My memory doesn't serve me all that well on that detail. Anyway, after arriving back, which, by the way, this was also in the evening. He radios over to me, saying that he is completely terrified, that these large men are chasing him. I tell him he's okay, and to just make it back as quick as he can. We agree to meet back at the station. Probably about 45 minutes later, I'm already there, waiting for my shift to get over, and he pops in, and I've never seen him so white in my life. Now, my colleague is a white boy, but he was very, very white. I'm talking, there's no other color in his skin other than pale, and the look on his face is completely terrified. Funny, I didn't think Irishman, because he is Irish, could get any more pale than that. Already being fair-skinned, he was so terrified, he just came and sat down, and we started talking. I asked him, what happened out there? He explained to me that, you're never going to believe this, but these giant wild hairy men chased me, nearly grabbing me. It's like they let me go. Had I not gone fast enough, they would have gotten to me. When I questioned him, saying, what do you mean wild hairy men? There's none of that out there. Do you mean, did you maybe see a bear? Are there monkeys or something? He just shook his head and looked at me. He said no. These beings that chased after him were around 8 to 9 feet tall, incredibly massive, covered in long hair, with faces that were very human. He said they looked like primitive humans, kind of like cavemen or Neanderthals, but giant, and they had black eyes. He was completely terrified. He said there was about 4 or 5 of them, and they flanked him, nearly overturning his vehicle. They chased him out of there and almost wonders if maybe that was where their village was, or their territory. I didn't mean to laugh at him, but I kind of just smirked, thinking, great, now we have a village of wild hairy men living on the park. My supervisor will love hearing this. Of course, I didn't fully believe him at the time, and I just figured maybe he had some sort of life situation happen that caused him to see things that weren't there. So I gave him a pat on the back, a hug, let him know I'm here for him if he wants to talk. Later on, the next day, my supervisor was told about what happened and pulled me into the office. He sat me down and explained, did you hear what had happened with David? I explained to him, yes, I had. He looked at me with the most stern and serious look I've ever seen on my supervisor's face, which, by the way, is a pretty jovial, happy guy, always cracking jokes, a prankster, if you will. This man has not been serious a day on the job in his life, so to see him like this, something was wrong. He leans over the table, maybe 8 inches away from my face, and says, whatever David told you is not to leave this building or this park. Do you understand me? I will never forget those words. He was so intent on his meaning. Not understanding and not being willing to question my boss's motives, I just nodded my head yes, and he says, okay, good. Now, get on your duty, leave my office. Something to those lines. I got up, pushed in my chair, and walked out. Very strange, right? Well, that's part 1. So, in the coming years, obviously that encounter or experience was kind of forgotten about by me, since David and my boss didn't really bring it up again. Well, over the next 4 years, from 95 to 99, there was expansion on the park, particularly trails and camping, that of course branched further out in that area. Now, where David was probably about 4.7 miles away from the station, over in that direction, northeast to be specific. With trails and camping areas expanding from 95 to 99, we had more encounters, I should say, or at least complaints from fellow hikers and campers. At around 98 is when a lot of the development was fully finished, even going into the spring of 99, where new trails were established and more camping spots were created, probably within a mile or two northeast in the same direction. This is when we began getting more and more complaints, People seeing strange men out in the woods. Figures. Horrible screams at night. This is when I began to put the pieces together and realized maybe David wasn't so crazy after all. My boss would not even speak on the issue, and as he told me before, whatever I learn, hear, see, or say is to be kept hush and not be spoken to outside of anybody within this park. I understood that enough that if I were to break that code of conduct, my career would be on the line, and I wasn't risking that, at least not at the time. But for me, I dealt with a lot of campers and hikers who had all sorts of stories from 98 to 99, right when this new development was pretty much being fully finalized. People were giddy to explore new areas and walk new trails. There was one loop in particular. I can't remember the name, but it did this big 5-mile loop, and of course it cut right through that northeast section, the same area in which David drove through. That's the same area in which people had complaints, seeing strange figures, hearing terrible noises, feeling like they were unsafe or being watched. Of course, me and David were called to investigate it almost every time. While I never saw or experienced anything myself, at least not until 2002, which I'll get to in another email, David had more encounters. And it eventually got so bad that by fall, November-ish, around 1999, we had to shut down the area entirely. Not the park, just this specific trail loop and parts of camping spots in this area. As I reflect and look back on all this, I almost wonder, did we come across Bigfoot territory? Maybe we encroached on their area. I don't know. At the time, I knew nothing of Bigfoot. Had I did, I don't even think that would have been something I believed in, because it wasn't until I saw one in 2002 myself, working as a ranger in a separate park, that I became a full-on believer and started really researching, deep diving into not just cryptozoology, but Bigfoots in general. I apologize in advance if this story is kind of short-lived, and I don't feel like there's a whole lot more I can add, which I'll continue in part 2. But either way, some scary stuff happened in that park. A few years ago, I experienced something that was terrifying. I'm actually lucky to still be around to tell the tale. I have a Great Dane, who, of course, we had to call Scooby. And just like her namesake, she's crazy, adorable, and a very good family pet. But unlike her lazy, laid-back cartoon version, our Scooby has boundless energy and needs a lot of exercise. Luckily for her, I like to jog, so oftentimes after dropping the kiddos off at school, Scoob and I would head off to one of the running trails in the woods. I felt it good to burn off some energy, absorb some much-needed vitamin D, and of course, burn those calories. One day, we were heading to our usual route, and we saw that the trail had been blocked off. Apparently, there had been a fallen tree and some damage to the surrounding area. This was due to a storm the night before. The worker was putting up a sign to tell joggers to avoid the path, suggesting an alternative route not too far away. It did lead further into the trees, he said, but wound up in the far parking lot at the other end of the wooded area. I hadn't been that way for years, since it is quite a bit longer, but since we didn't really have a choice, and Scooby was always bouncing up and down, I decided to give it a try. Now, I may be a lone female, but I am sensible. I know and plan my routes. I text my husband when I leave the house. When I return, I don't wear earbuds. This way I can always be prepared for what's going on around me. I never run at night, and most importantly, I have a giant security guard with me at all times. Scooby may be a softie when it comes to her family, but she is also very protective. And that doesn't mean she didn't slobber all over strangers, of course. It just meant that she somehow sensed we were always safe. Being on a new trail, of course, meant a lot of excitement. Stopping to sniff and go potty every few minutes. There was just so many new things to smell and leave her scent on. Her tail was wagging constantly. She kept making happy little yaps every now and again. I was smiling. All was well. And I watched her bound over to some bushes, scare a poor woodchuck. She never hurts them. I honestly think she just doesn't know how big she is and wants to play. I was still chuckling at the look on the woodchuck's face when all of a sudden, she stops in the middle of the trail and went stiff. Again, like a cartoon dog, when Pluto acts like a pointer for Mickey. She was standing still, just staring at something up ahead. The hackles rose on the back of her neck, and I heard a noise I don't hear very often, a low and angry growl. She did not seem frightened, more alert and on edge, ready to attack, which is highly unusual behavior. She got down low, and I could see her teeth were bared as she continued to growl. I didn't want to frighten her by calling out, and to be honest, she was making me nervous. Not because I thought that she might do something to me, but because I trusted her instinct. If she wasn't happy, then something was wrong. I just had no clue as to what it might be. She suddenly leapt full pelt into the bushes in front of her, and I heard a shout. At first, I was concerned she'd hurt somebody, although my thought process quickly turned to what on earth somebody was doing behind those bushes. I could hear her growling and barking, and there was some rustling, so I called to her sharply to get back to me. As I said, she's a very good dog, so when she didn't come on my first command, I was surprised, rose my voice. "Scooby, here." This time, she did as she was told. I heard another yell from whoever was in the bush as Scooby came running back over to me. I could just make out a hooded figure running away. It was all in the shadows of trees and on the other side of the bushes. It was really blurry, just like the silhouette of a person that I could see. I didn't bother calling out to them to check if they were okay, as they seemed to be wanting to get away real quick and were still shaken from Scooby's reaction. I looked down at her, and she had this sort of sorry mom look on her face and eyes. She was also holding a torn piece of green fabric in her mouth. I took it from her. It looked like it was sweater material. I guess she must have ripped it from this person's hoodie. Now, instead of heading the same way as the bush hider, we turned back and made our way back to the start. The worker was gone now. Just the sign blocking the usual trail remained. We headed home, and I called my husband to tell him we were back and what had happened. He surprised me by saying that he was coming straight home and that I should call the police. When I asked why, he asked if I had read the news this morning. I had not. I'd planned on grabbing a coffee and sitting on the porch after reading it, after the jog. He told me to quickly look at it whilst he drove home, then called the detective mentioned on the front of the page. I grabbed the paper and gasped as I read the story. Local police were looking for a young man who had raped and killed at least 3 different women. There had only been one witness so far, as the killer tended to hide in quiet in secluded wooded areas, preying on lone women. He hadn't realized one of his victims had been waiting for their teenage son to catch up. He'd caught a very quick glimpse of his mom's attacker before he'd taken a knock to the head and passed out. All he could remember was that the killer was young, male, and apparently wearing a green hoodie. Also, said to be seen within this radius.
There are all sorts of things that you can find in the woods. They have often been the setting for dark tales and believable ghost stories. Depending on your point of view, the deeper you get into the forest could be magical, if you believe in fairies,
educational if you enjoy nature and learning about foliage, or downright terrifying if you believe in monsters. This story that I'm about to share with you happened to me within the last year, and it's safe to say I will never be the same again. Since we were in the middle of COVID restrictions, I had to appease my wanderlust and travel bug by staying local. It actually gave me a much-needed push to discover some of the huge parks and forests that surround me in my own part of SoCal. There was enough to keep me going for years on my own doorstep. One of the best things about hiking, that it's totally socially distanced. On the day in question, I had already decided that I was going to head as far into the woods as possible. I'd even brought some meager supplies along, including a pop-up tent, just so I can camp out, not having to be tied to the timings of daylight. The few hikers I had seen on recent trips were totally okay with a curt nod, no idle chit-chat, and staying apart, and masks. I was fine with that. In fact, I hadn't seen another person for the entire day on this whole trek. Not even a ranger. I was more than happy with that. Looking back, there was very little animal activity, but at the time, I didn't really notice. As the sun began to lower and a cool breeze descended, along with a super loud growl from my belly, alerting me to the fact it was way past dinner, I decided to stop and set up camp for the night being. I was just getting myself sorted, clearing the area for a small fire, when I heard the voice. Now, of course, I don't own those woods. I didn't have the sole right to be there. But, not having seen or heard anything at all for the entirety, and now suddenly, a voice appearing out of nowhere was a little unnerving. I hadn't been able to make out exactly what the person had said. It was kind of muffled, but I called back a cordial hello in response, since that seemed to be the thing to do. Again, just a muffled grunting sound, and I began to wonder if it was actually an animal instead. If you don't know, you'd be surprised just how human certain sounds from certain creatures can be. Like a deer, expelling breath can sound exactly like a human cough or a sneeze. Then there was also a terrible smell. Even now, I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, or even what it reminded me of. The closest thing I would say would be old eggs or a blocked sink drain. That almost sulfurous odor, which is utterly repellent. There was some rustling. I expected some survivor type to come racing out of the bushes, filthy, stinking, muttering garbage due to starvation, or just something, but nobody came out. "Are you okay in there?" I felt compelled to ask, not really wanting to hear no as a reply. But I didn't get any kind of answer, and there was no more noise. The smell, however, remained, partially covered by the smoke from the small fire that I made. If I hadn't been so tired, and it wasn't so incredibly dark, I might have moved camp. But unbelievably, despite feeling a little on edge, I fell deep asleep pretty quickly. And man, it must have been literally the deepest sleep I have ever been in, as when I woke up around 5 a.m., all hell had broke loose. My tent, only being small and not intended to be highly durable anyway, had been ripped to pieces. The shredded material flapping in the morning breeze. The few belongings I had in my backpack had been emptied out and scattered. The tin of chili I was intending to have for breakfast smashed open and eaten. The small fire was out, and by the smell of it, it had been doused with urine. Something had peed on it to put it out, and it was strong. The ammonia actually stung my eyes. It looked for all intents and purposes like an animal attack, although I was completely uninjured, thank God. The strangest thing of all, though, were the 2 sets of footprints in the dirt surrounding the carnage. Well, there were 3, actually. I recognized my own set of hiking boots. The other two were harder to explain. One set definitely appeared human, although barefoot rather than a shoe print, and the other, well, the thing it most resembled was a goat, I guess. That cloven hoof. Was I attacked by a barefooted man with a pet goat, who just so happened to have sharp enough fingernails to rip through my tent, sharp enough teeth to pierce a tin can, and strong enough urine to make my eyes sting? I grabbed the few salvageable items and hot-footed it out of there as fast as I could. The whole experience was scary, but despite that, most of all, I'm thankful that, for whatever reason, whatever that was did not attack me, and that somehow, despite the activity, I remained peacefully unaware in my sleep.